The protagonist, lying on her bed, waited for the maid to help her with her hair, and the maid excitedly looked at the mistress and asked if she liked the weather outside. Anastasia Sinclair only smiled happily and said that the weather was wonderful, and then the maid looked her over carefully and told her that if she was cold, she must tell her. The girl's name was Anastasia Sinclair, and she was the daughter of an earl, as well as the first beauty of the empire. But in this body, the main character found herself about a month ago, because previously she was a completely different person and could never have thought that one of her favorite books will become a reality for her. But the problem was that Anastasia Sinclair had a terminal illness. It was actually quite ironic that the name Anastasia meant resurrection, even though the book started right at that point, after her death. Then, bleeding due to illness, the girl thought about the fact that her heroine only appears in the book when the protagonist remembers her. But suddenly seeing that the girl was covered in blood, a worried maid approached her and, wiping the blood from her face with a small handkerchief, informed her that her cough had recently become insanely violent. But Anastasia Sinclair, seeing the anxiety on Irina's face, tried to explain that she should not worry about it. Then she said that she should wash. But at that moment, her maid smiled brightly and told her that she had to remember to take her medicine before she went to clean herself up, as it was her daily routine. Anastasia Sinclair only grudgingly remarked that the medicine wouldn't help anyway. But the maid was adamant, and Severe looked at the girl and said that in any case the girl must take the medicine, and though they could not cure her, but they could soothe her pain. But the heroine was madly dissatisfied, looking at the medicine and the glass of water that was brought to her, and didn't understand why she would be poisoned with such a poison if she was going to die anyway because of the disease that plagued her. The disease was so rare that it didn't even have a name. And eventually in the book, her character died before her 18th birthday, right in the arms of the protagonist. And in the end, the protagonist and the heroine of this book met for the first time at a funeral, which was very symbolic because their love was cemented by death. But in the end, Anastasia Sinclair was not sad and thought that in principle she would die anyway. But she could live in the body of such a beautiful girl, especially since her past case had already faced a much worse fate. After which I remember my last minutes after the accident, the protagonist stated that most likely by this time she had already managed to die. But after forbidding herself to think of it, she drank the medicine, but it was so disgusting that she immediately began to vomit. And this did not go unnoticed by the anxious maid who was always at her side, and anxiously examining her, inquired how she could help her. Anastasia Sinclair only asked that the candy with which she had always taken such a terribly bitter medicine be brought to her as soon as possible. In the end, after a while, the girl was already feeling better, and then another maid came into her room and informed her that her bedroom had already been cleaned. The girl only smiled happily and thanked the maid for being so concerned about her. But the next moment, shocking the protagonist, the maid warned her that Mr. Adil Magnus was already rushing over. But she only frightened her maid Irina abruptly got up from her seat and asked her to tell her that she was insanely tired and asleep. Then she ran out of the room without even looking back at the excited maids who were watching the whole thing. Then Irina, who had been brushing her hair before, excitedly told her mistress that her head was still not dry. As a result, a couple of moments later, the girl was already lying in her bed and looking at the ceiling, realizing that she was absolutely not ready to meet a young man. Adil Magnus was a typical man who was for all good and against all bad, and this was the main character of this book. And in the future, he was to become a true knight, who was born to lead the people. He was noble, kind, and perfectly just. And even in fighting against his enemy, he never insulted another's honor. And as head of a duchy in one of the leading empires of the day, he adored everyone, even the simple townspeople, and it was his straightforward kindness that made him everyone's favorite. But the moment he entered the room, the protagonist immediately closed her eyes and pretended to be asleep so that he would leave her alone as soon as possible. But as soon as he came in, he immediately approached the girl and asked if she was asleep. And then wiping the table with his finger, on which there were still drops of her blood, he stated that she was bleeding again. And the girl, only listening to his voice, stated that his voice was insanely deep and also perfectly suited to any protagonist. But the next moment he apologized with one sharp sweep and pulled the blanket off the main character. And that's when she screamed loudly. When Adil Magnus heard her displeasure, he stated with a smile on his face. The girl literally couldn't take her eyes off him because the guy was really handsome. But afterwards, after enduring his gaze, she grudgingly informed him that it was insanely insolent to take a blanket from a lady like that. Would she still continue to avoid his gaze like that? and wondered why she's still so deeply resentful of him because of the festival. At that moment, the girl remembered what had happened and admitted that she was really angry with him. She wanted to see the fireworks, but in the end, when they had a conversation about it, Adil Magnus just strictly forbade her to leave the estate, because of which the girl was mad. So she turned away from him and told him that Adil Magnus knew she didn't have much time left and hadn't let her go to the festival. She was grateful for his concern, of course, but added that she didn't want to spend the rest of her life in a room. But then, placing his hands on Anastasia's bed, a worried Adil Magnus informed her that she shouldn't just give up her life like that. After all, they would surely find a cure. But she just calmly said that there was nothing in this world that would help her. It just didn't exist. And the guy only inquired about her certainty. Then the protagonist only covered her eyes and grudgingly informed that she was the only person who has it, and her disease brings almost no suffering except minimal inconvenience. But at that moment, taking her by the hand, the excited young man asked her to continue to hold out the slightest hope of recovery, and asked her to do so for the sake of her mother's father and also for his sake, as he did not want to lose her. But at this moment, only as much as possible unhappily looking at him, Anastasia Sinclair stated that sometimes she was tired of such meaningless conversations and the fact that she was always pitying. But she realized that she simply could not chase out of her house so kind guy. She said she couldn't hold out hope because she was going to die anyway. So she asked Adil Magnus to accept that as a fact and not to be sad when she died. And then she wondered if that was all he had to say. But the guy, excitedly looking at her, apologized and said that earlier her father had asked him to take care of her. So before he returned to their house, he was fully responsible for the protagonist. It seemed that she was a little embarrassed by what she heard. But the next moment she looked at him decisively and a little angrily and told him that if nothing could be changed, the guy should just protect her when they were outside. But then she immediately realized that such a reaction was unacceptable and asked herself mentally to calm down. Since he wasn't her husband, she had to talk to him like that. But the guy didn't seem to be offended by this reaction at all. So with a smile, he apologized for making her even more angry. But he still said that the girl was very weak and that she might pass out on the street. When she heard about it, the protagonist seemed to be frantic with such concern, and then mentally stated that such arguments were tiring her out. Realizing that the girl would remain adamant, the boy decided to make a concession and said that she could use a short walk. So he said that if she was all right, they would go for a walk tomorrow. So she agreed. But the next moment, when left alone, she angrily started eating candy to gain strength, and mentally promised that she would be stronger tomorrow to get revenge on Adil Magnus for his attitude and for not letting her go and see the fireworks that time. So after a couple of minutes, there were only colorful wrappers around the girl, and the maid reached out to throw them away. But the protagonist, finishing the last candy, said that she should leave them, as she will still need them. After which the madwoman smiled slyly and thought about something. As a result, the next day the protagonist, beautifully dressed, greeted Adil Magnus, and smiling brightly said that she was feeling much better and therefore fully ready for the upcoming walk. The guy only smiled happily and extended his hand to her so that they could go together and help her. Then he said with the same smile that he was very happy that the girl was so much alive. But she only looked at his hand uncertainly and turned away, then said she could go on her own. But at that moment, the guy awkwardly removed his hand and asked. He awkwardly apologized and said that he would be happy even to walk next to the girl. The two young people ended up walking nicely in the street. And at that moment, the girl stopped and asked if she could ask Adil Magnus for help. But he said with a smile that he would help her if it was within the law. Then, sadly lowering her head, the protagonist admitted that she had only a short time to live and had long ago accepted that she would soon die. Even so, in this short period of time, she would like to see as many things outside of her estate as possible. After which she reported even more sadly that despite her ever so slight posthumous wish, the guy kept stopping her all the time and wouldn't let her do it. But the flustered young man only informed her that he was only doing it all for her benefit. But at that moment, the girl couldn't stand it. And then she grabbed the hem of his clothes and pulled him closer to her, and said that if Adil Magnus really wanted to do something to make her feel better, he should start taking her opinion into account, and warned that if he was so heartless, he could continue to ignore her wishes, but she wouldn't forgive him for that even in death. It seemed that Adil Magnus was really shocked by what he heard and didn't know what to say, and for a while he couldn't even utter a word. Then he apologized and told the protagonist that he thought his actions were meant to make her feel better and asked, Had his actions always tormented her so much? But after a moment smiling and looking at the girl attentively, he asked, "Report her earnest wish," after which he swore on his life that he would surely help her. At that moment, the protagonist's eyes lit up with happiness as she realized that her plan had worked. Then she smiled sweetly and said that her wish was that Adil Magnus would come to her every day in his free time. But the boy was only surprised. Was that really her wish? After that, the girl smiled madly again while her hair blew in the warm wind, and said that she appreciated everything Adil Magnus had done for her and was very touched by it. So she would like to spend her last days in his company. But the guide, only madly embarrassed, literally did not know how to react to it. After which he said that all this time he was sure that the girl hated him with all his soul. At first, the main character was surprised, but after I remembered that the book version of Anastasia had a rather ambiguous character, and even with her family she behaved rather coldly and aloof. Anastasia Sinclair had been venting her anger over her illness on Adele only recently before she got into this body. And most likely even the guy couldn't handle it anymore. But because of his kindness, he kept watching the girl and treating her kindly, because he realized that she was having a much harder time. But distracting her from her thoughts was the voice of Adil Magnus, who looked at her worriedly and said that he realized how much the girl didn't like it. But despite that, he just couldn't stop worrying about her. Then he added that he realized that the protagonist still didn't trust him, but at least he was insanely glad that at least she hated him. Upon hearing this, Anastasia Sinclair smiled happily and said that she was pleased that they were able to resolve the conflict, then offered them a handshake in honor of their reconciliation. And at that moment, the girl caught herself thinking that she was madly worried at such a seemingly trivial gesture, as she could now touch the main character of the novel. And as soon as she could, she tried to feel much calmer, but then exhaled a sly smile, realizing that it was just about time for her to take her place, and seemed pleased with this little bit of guile of hers. The young man smilingly turned to the young man and asked him to look at her hand, where the wrapper was lying, and the next moment she threw the wrapper on the ground. But at that moment she blocked his way and with a stern look at him informed him that earlier the guy had promised to do anything for her, and so she wanted him not to pick up the thing. But he just said with a worried look on his serious face that you can't throw garbage in the garden. But she calmly looked at him and said that he was absolutely right. And now she decided to go against the rules, and she's also not going to pick up the trash. Hearing such a thing, the boy was madly shocked, and looking into his bewildered face, Anastasia Sinclair madly joyfully realized that in all probability he was getting angry, as the instinct of an obedient child in him was literally torn to pieces. Then he straightened up excitedly and looked at the girl and asked her for what reason she was acting so strangely. But she calmly informed him that she was just being a bad person. Then she put another wrapper in his hand, and with a sly smile said it was his turn to go, against the rules. But excited Adil Magnus only said that he couldn't do that and said that he didn't want to break the rules. But the protagonist, it seems, was ready for something like that. So she looked at him sternly and seriously and said that in that case, she would no longer believe him because he could not keep his word, and that was a great disappointment to her. The one madly shocked looking at the wrapper in his hands asked why Anastasia does this to him. But she only calmly said that it was just a waste of time and unhappily began to leave. But the next moment, the voice of the guy who stopped her and still clutching the wrapper in his hand said that he would do it and keep his promise. And then with a madly guilty look, he put the wrapper down on the floor. Then smiling happily, Anastasia Sinclair ran up to him and patted him on the shoulder and told him that he had indeed kept his promise, but then told him that if he came back later and picked up those wrappers, their relationship would be over. He agreed to this, but the protagonist saw that the young man continued to look at the wrappers lying on the garden floor, and looking into his sad face thought that he looked insanely cute. But after pretending that she didn't notice it, she smiled madly, literally glowing with happiness, and said that she hoped they could be friends now. Bottom line, after a while their walk ended and the protagonist found herself at home, where the maid asked her how her first walk in a long time had gone, and she, remembering the day, only said that everything had gone well enough, as the weather was refreshing enough, and besides, Adil Magnus was insanely kind to her. But afterwards she thought with some sadness that she was in a little confusion, for she had decided to live the rest of her time without regrets. But she was concerned about her relationship with Adil Magnus. After that, I remembered the face of the young guy. The girl stated that he still hadn't met the main character of the book, and therefore his attitude towards the girl hadn't changed in any way yet. But afterwards, she thought excitedly about what would happen if she fell in love with such a good-natured guy. After all, she was just his friend, and one couldn't forget about it. When the maid heard her little story, she smiled happily and said that she was very pleased that the girl had enjoyed her walk. Then she bent down, and the protagonist immediately realized what was waiting for her. Then the maid, holding out a tray of medicine to her, told her that it was time for her to take it, and the girl only looked at it unhappily, realizing that she had guessed it would be like this from the beginning. So she abruptly got out of her seat and began to run away, and the maid with a smile looking at this only ran after the protagonist, saying that she will not be able to avoid taking medication, as she needed it. After a while, the girl found herself in a marvelously beautiful garden sprinkled with pink flowers and was madly delighted with this view. After that, she became excited and thought that she absolutely did not understand what Adil had forgotten here. She turned around to look at the guy who was keeping her company, but when she saw him, she was shocked. She found him insanely attractive, so she wondered if he'd always been this handsome. But suddenly, he spoke to her in a languid and soft voice, after which he suddenly approached her and touched her hair and face with his hand, tucking her hair behind her ear, and informed the girl that she was insanely dear to him, after which, praising her beauty, grace, and appearance, asked if he could kiss her. The next moment, the protagonist woke up in terror. After that, she started looking around, and with a confused look on her face, did not understand why she had such a dream. She got up from her seat, and sitting on the bed began to look at her hands, and tried to catch her breath, as after a nightmare, and tried to answer herself the question of why she had such a dream, because everything was insanely realistic. She hid her embarrassed face in the blanket and thought that she shouldn't be sad, because she should be, because Adele Magnus was going to fall in love with the main character of the book. But afterwards, she sadly realized that everything looked like she had already managed to fall in love with this guy. Afterwards, she sadly thought about the fact that she was fully aware of the events that were to happen after she died, but despite that, still couldn't avoid such silly and inappropriate feelings. In the end, after a sleepless night, the maid came to the main character and handed her a letter and told her that this letter came from her brother. She was madly surprised, but then unfolded it to read it. In a letter to her sister, her brother said that earlier the butler reported about her health, and her brother was madly happy that she did not lose heart even in such situations. Reading this, the protagonist literally could not hold back a smile because she loved her family madly, and then continued to read that her brother was now in the north. Then he said that he was planning to meet his parents in a couple weeks, and this time he would come back with good news. Then the girl thought about the fact that her character's parents in the book are a family that has been traveling the world for a long time. And when she was reborn in this body, everyone immediately noticed that her condition began to deteriorate. So they all got together and went in search of a cure. And it was a strong family, not like many nobles. The girl had an insanely kind father, a strict, but also insanely loving mother, and an older brother who always teased her. But to the great regret of the main, harrowing to her so that no one noticed the substitution, Anastasia came to surrender her parents only coldness and indifference. And it was quite sad, because her family really loved this girl. After which I remember myself in the past, the protagonist stated that her family never noticed her, but ignored her all her life, and they didn't even want to meet her eyes. Then she thought about the fact that ever since she was a little girl, she had fallen asleep alone, and even ate alone. And although she had always lived with her parents in the same house, it felt as if they were in completely different worlds. After which she reflected that she'd never received parental love, and so it was insanely unfamiliar to her. But when she got used to this attitude, she was even able to smile sometimes when talking to her new family. And she did it so that no one would regret anything, because then the love of her new parents would not be in vain. The last lines of the letter were dedicated to Adele Magnus, and the protagonist's brother asked her if she thought he was strange because he was always walking around her and keeping her in suspense. But in the next moment, a strange thought crept into her head, and the girl, madly embarrassed, began to mentally berate herself for acting like a girl in love. Then she realized that Adil Magnus was simply very handsome, and embarrassed by her reaction, she began to look for bad qualities in him and wondered if the guy was too straightforward and stupid. And just that combination threw her out of her sense of balance. But afterwards, she couldn't stop there and stated that Adil Magnus was also sweet and made her want something more. But she was mad about it, which did not go unnoticed by her maid, who asked if she was all right. But Anastasia Sinclair was fully in her thoughts that it was absolutely unfair of her to act as if she wanted to take someone else's boyfriend for herself. But eventually, a new idea popped into her head that she wanted to pursue. So smiling at the maid, she asked for her help in carrying out her new revenge. Then the protagonist long chose what outfit to choose and how else she wants to emphasize her beauty. But in the end, picked up the perfect laconic image and looked really delightful. Then looking around herself thought that Adil Magnus just cannot take his eyes off her. In the end, when he came to visit her, he greeted the girl and she, happy to answer him in the same way. And with a smile said that earlier she had asked the chef to make his favorite ginger cookies and madly hoped that he would like it. At that moment, the excited guy reached for the cookie, and the main character immediately realized that this was the time to act. So she reached out her hand for the cookie at the same moment he did, and at that moment their hands touched. At this point, the frightened guy immediately apologized and said that he should have given her a seat, but she was excited by this reaction from the guy, calmed him down and said that he could safely take the cookies. But suddenly her attention was drawn to his handsome hands, and she informed Adil Magnus that they were quite elegant and asked that he let her compare their hands. He only calmly looking them over informed her that his hands were large and quite rough. But afterwards, he held out his palm to her and told her that if she wanted to compare, he couldn't resist her wish. And then when their hands joined, the protagonist stated that he had long as well as strong fingers. When Adil Magnus heard this, he was madly embarrassed and said that Anastasia Sinclair was embarrassed by such words. Then he added that for some reason the calluses on his hands healed very quickly. But she only mentally thought that it was just part of his power, since he was a swordsmanship genius. After which the protagonist, approaching him, asked him what he thought of her hands, and he only looked at them and said that her hands were small and delicate, as if they would fall apart if touched. But the main character only calmly remarked that they had already held hands yesterday, and yet everything was fine. But Adele calmly informed him that it was only a metaphor, and especially since they were friends and their touching was completely different. She looked into his worried face and asked him if he regretted anything like that. Then she said that she thought everything was fine and she was fine with it. It seems that Adil Magnus was happy about this, and then shocking the main character said that he was mad that she was not mad at him, and said that other people just reproached him all his life for his mistakes, and she constantly forgives everything, and even helps him to become a better person. So the guy was madly grateful to her for this. Then the protagonist looked him over and realized that he probably didn't care about her efforts because he wasn't interested in her at all, and that's just human solidarity. But the next moment, abruptly removing her hand in offense, the protagonist turned away and grudgingly reported that Adil Magnus was annoying her immensely. He was very surprised and therefore excitedly inquired what he had done wrong. Then excitedly rose from his seat and said that Anastasia Sinclair should just tell him where he was wrong, and then he could fix it. But the girl was only displeased and said that when she saw him like this, she wanted to make fun of him even more. Hearing this, Adil Magnus was madly surprised and did not even know how to react. But the girl did not pay attention to his confusion, smiling happily offer him to go and steal some food. He was very surprised, but the next moment the girl took him by the hand and they ran away. In the end, after a while they were in the kitchen, where they were excitedly watching the servants and cooks preparing food. And then pointing to a cake in the middle of the table, the girl explained that it was a special pecan cake from their chef, and every time the chef made it, he put his soul into it, then said that they should steal it. Then they immediately took the cake and sat down hiding behind the table. And the next moment, there was the excited voice of the chef, who wondered where his pie had gone, because he had left it here, and thought sadly that his precious pie had disappeared. But then agitated, peering out from under the table at Chef Adil Magnus, asked, "Why is Anastasia Sinclair acting like this? And why can't she give Chef the pie since it was made for her anyway? So Chef will surely give it to her if she asks." But the protagonist only awkwardly wondered if the chef was overplaying his emotions. But despite that, Adil Magnus didn't notice it. After that, she was surprised enough that the guy believed her little deception after all. But then she realized that since everything was fine, she could make fun of Adele a little further. So she took a bite of the pie and asked him if he wanted to try a piece too. But all he could do was look at the chef standing there in tears, and was sad because he couldn't find his masterpiece nut cake. So Adele said they should give it to him. But the protagonist, finishing a piece of pie, said that she was already full anyway, so they could return the rest and then run away. And Adil Magnus, only awkwardly looking at her, said that he had never done such a thing before and wondered why she was acting so strangely. But the protagonist only wondered did the guy still not understand, because she was throwing garbage around. as well as stealing pies, and she behaved like a bad person with no conscience or principles. Then, with a smile looking at the guy, she said that he was her accomplice, so he was guilty too. But then smiled and said that this time she was willing to listen to him, and so they would put the pie back where it belonged. Then she got up from her seat and called the chef, asking if he had a pie he was looking for. She got up from her seat and called the chef, asking him if this was the pie he was looking for. Then she held it out and put it on the table, saying that she had eaten only one slice. And then pointing to Adele Magnus and laughing said that it was the guy who stole it because he was insanely hungry. The flustered young man tried to communicate that a mistake had been made and that the chef should not trust this girl. But the next moment he was looked at by two disgruntled faces who inquired. But the bewildered Adele Magnus only frightenedly said that he had done absolutely nothing, and it was unfair that he was being accused of it. Eventually, in the evening, the protagonist, together with Adele Magnus, went outside the manor house and looked joyfully about all around, reporting that now it was very beautiful outside, everything was shining. But the guy looking at her informed her that the most beautiful among all these lights shone names. It seems hearing such a girl madly strongly embarrassed, and did not know how to react to it. Then awkwardly thanked Adele Magnus for agreeing to take her to the festival, and he calmly replied that he should thank her for agreeing to go with him. Then, looking at the girl carefully, Adele informed her that if she launched a lantern from here, it would fly insanely far away, and also reminded Anastasia Sinclair to make a wish. But the girl only looked sadly at her lantern and wondered if it was really necessary to start it up. She wanted to keep it for herself. But looking at the sad protagonist, Adele Magnus smiled and said that he had a solution to this situation, and she could start her lantern and take his lantern for herself. She was madly surprised at such a decision. So she asked what would happen to his wish, but he only smiled and looked at the girl, said that his main wish was that the wish of the main character would come true. In the end, she was madly embarrassed to launch the lantern into the sky and then awkwardly asked if they could already go ashore. And Adele Magnus didn't seem to notice her embarrassment, so she happily agreed. Eventually, when they ended up on the shore, then the guy, like a true gentleman, helped her get down from the boat, and for a moment, they lingered in front of each other against the background of insanely beautiful lights. But the next moment, the main character's attention was attracted by a shop that sold desserts, and there was cotton candy. So she happily grabbed the guy's hand and ran that way, and offered to buy them. After that, she told the boy that it was necessary to eat sweets at the festival, because without it, the festival could not be considered complete. At the next moment, near the same place where Anastasia Sinclair wanted to approach, she noticed some girl. And then the protagonist realized that apparently this girl is Olga, who is the main character of this book. She excitedly grabbed Adele Magnus's hand and told her that she had changed her mind and that they should head in the other direction. Adele absolutely didn't understand where the girl was taking him. There was nothing in that direction. As she ran, her mind kept thinking that the first meeting between Adele Magnus and Alda was to take place at her funeral, so she didn't understand why everything was happening so fast. And then she sadly realized that if they met now, the guy would fall in love with her, and his attitude would change, and she didn't want the girl to take the guy away from her. She wanted to spend the rest of her life with him. In the end, they ran for a while the protagonist didn't think about the direction she was taking. But at the last moment, she was stopped by an excited guy who asked me to be careful and watch my step. She was madly surprised, so she wondered what he meant. But then she looked around the area she had run into and noticed that there were an insane number of immobile people who were alive but seemingly unconscious. And then the guy stated that it looked like there had been a fight in this place, during which men had been hurt. Then the protagonist, covering her nose and mouth with her hand, thought about the fact that there was an insanely disgusting odor of alcohol and blood here. But Adele Magnus' voice came to the rescue, apologizing for his rudeness. He gently put his arm around her waist and told her to leave. But the excited girl only looked at the young man in front of her and asked if they needed to call for help. But he looked seriously at Anastasia and said that she was much more important to him than these people, and that he could call for help after he had taken her to a safe place. Eventually, the protagonist and her boyfriend came out of that alley, and the girl said, in the end, because the guy was still holding her waist, they looked like a couple in love, and everyone was literally looking at them. But eventually, after a while, Adele Magnus took her to a small cafe and sat her down at a table and told her that she would be safe here. Then he warned her that he had to leave for a while to call the guards and asked her to wait for him. The girl only waved him goodbye happily and asked him to be careful. then thought that she could never have thought that she was more important to him than helping other people. And she was madly excited because she was very happy about it. But interrupting her joy was the voice of an unknown man who asked if he could sit at her table. After all the other seats were occupied, the girl was madly surprised, but without even looking at the young man and allow him to do so. But when she looked back at him, she realized it was Cloud, who looked at Anastasia with a smile and asked if she'd been dumped by her partner. As soon as the girl saw this guy, she remembered that in the book, this guy was Adele Magnus's main opponent, and he and the main character of the book have known each other for a long time. She awkwardly returned the young man's gaze and told him that her partner would be back shortly. But at that moment, a young man's voice was heard, who suggested that they talk before her partner returned to her, and inquired whether she was a noblewoman, and then stated that noblewomen were rare in such places, and then said that he had previously thought that Olga would like this place, but it seemed that this was not the case. When Anastasia Sinclair heard of Olga's presence, she was madly surprised and did not understand how she could have gathered all the trouble in one moment, and then decided to clarify and smiled. I wondered. He didn't come here alone, but he calmly said he wanted to introduce the girl he came with. The protagonist tried to inform that it should not be done, but Mr. Cloud absolutely did not listen to her and immediately called Olga, because of which Anastasia Sinclair was madly displeased, because she thought it was impolite. At the next moment, a girl approached him. It was the protagonist of the novel Alda Florence, who came closer and said hello to the protagonist. But the girl, adopting her usual cold expression, told the girl that she could address her simply as Anastasia Sinclair, after which she thought mentally that this behavior did not suit her at all. Then approaching her, Olda Florence inquired, "Did such a beautiful girl as Anastasia Sinclair come here alone?" But she calmly reported that my companion had just stepped away to report a fight in the alley. Olda seemed very surprised by what she heard. Then she said that it was probably their fault because she had been accosted by a couple of drunks who wouldn't leave peacefully. So Ash Cloud stood up for her, and the situation was not resolved peacefully. Here, this Anastasia Sinclair stated that Ash's character was exactly as described in the novel. Looking at Anastasia Sinclair with embarrassment, Olda wondered if she was really an aristocrat, because Ash Cloud usually did not start conversations first. When Anastasia Sinclair heard this, she only laughed awkwardly, and then thought that it was rather obvious. After all, Huge Cloud was the son of the Marquis, who sees aristocrats from a mile away, and then thought that she wished the young men had left before Adele Magnus returned. But the next moment his voice rang out and he looked at them in surprise. And Anastasia Sinclair, shocked, looking at the guy who approached, she didn't understand why now was the moment he decided to come. But when Adele Magnus saw Cloud, he grudgingly asked Anastasia if this guy was her companion. But Adele Magnus reacted calmly enough and simply greeted Cloud. But he smiled slyly and looked at the boy in front of him, and said that there were a lot of disreputable citizens walking around here, so he shouldn't have left the lady alone here. Looking at this picture, the girl realized that she probably did not mention her surname, but she had already realized that she was the Count's daughter. But distracting her from her musings was the voice of a disgruntled Adele Magnus, who looked at the Claude and asked since when did he start worrying about anyone but himself. Then he turned to Anastasia with a smile and suggested that she find another place to rest. She was madly surprised by such a thing. Then she looked at Olga and wondered about Adele Magnus's reaction. She was his soulmate, and he didn't even look in her direction. That's why she was excited. Looking at the young man, she asked if he knew Claudius. And Ash immediately got up from his seat and asked for an opportunity to introduce himself, and after giving his name, said that he had met Adele Magnus a couple of times. But suddenly there was the voice of an excited girl looking at Adele Magnus, wondering if he was really that legendary guy, and informed her that her parents had told her a crazy amount about him. Then she approached him and, madly shining brightly, said that the guy was insanely kind, honest, fair, as well as a genius swordsman, and also insanely good at magic. Adele Magnus looked at her unhappily and didn't understand what she wanted to say. But Olga only said that fate had apparently brought them together, and asked if they could talk for a while. But Adele Magnus calmly said that it was time for him to leave, so he turned away apologetically and started to walk away. But at that moment, there came the voice of an excited Olga, who asked if they could meet tomorrow, and then said that she and Ash would be there to light the lanterns, and if he came, they could talk. But Adele Magnus paid absolutely no attention to it and walked up to the protagonist and took her by the hand and dragged her along to get her out of the place. and promptly left the cave. And while they were leaving, Ishcloud only laughed at Olga and said that it looked like their goddesses at the beauty for the first time someone ignored them. The main character, only looking at these two, did not understand what went wrong, because Adil reacted absolutely not as he should. So when they came out, she smiled awkwardly as they approached him and asked if Olga was pretty to him and if he thought she was beautiful. But the guy only hesitantly replied that he didn't know if she was beautiful or not. But Anastasia Sinclair didn't seem to understand this answer, so she asked if the guy felt his heart beating faster after he remembered Olga. But he only calmly said that his heart started beating insanely fast when the girl dragged him into her adventures. But Anastasia Sinclair only grudgingly remarked that she was being completely serious, because she thought that Adil Magnus must have fallen in love with this girl, or felt at least something. But he calmly looked at Anastasia Sinclair and told her that he wasn't sensual enough to fall in love with the first person he saw. And I think the girl was literally shocked, because he was saying all these words about the original main character of the novel, with whom he was brought together by fate itself. But at this point, the guy continued and said that apparently Anastasia Sinclair did not know him well, because he would never be with a girl who sees him only as an ideal, because it's wrong. Anastasia Sinclair seemed madly surprised at this, but Adele Magnus only smiled and said that he was actually a madly simple man. Looking at his face, she immediately thought that she was madly mistaken because they were not in a trivial affair. And Adele Magnus was also suffering because everyone thought he was perfect, and these expectations were weighing on him insanely. So she decided not to push like that anymore and smiled and offered him some cotton candy. And the guy only smilingly asked, was she really going to throw trash around again? At that moment, the main character, literally glowing, smiled and wondered what it was about, because throwing in the trash was insanely bad, and she had never done such a thing. After all, the place of garbage in the trash. Then the protagonist happily sat on a bench and ate her cotton candy, thinking that after she had managed to do everything she had planned, she could safely go home. But at that moment, a group of robbers came up to them, and looking unhappily at the main character, and Adil Magnus asked if these young men had informed the guards about their fight. Whereupon the man approached the lad with a threat and grudgingly remarked that they had been fined because he had told the guard about everything. At that moment, the protagonist suddenly felt that the excitement had made her feel insanely ill, and she began to realize that she was having another coughing fit, which always ended in blood. And this did not go unnoticed by the madly frightened Adil Magnus, who immediately shouted at the bandit that they should move back. But he only looked at the guy threateningly and said that he was not going to go anywhere, as they came for their money. Then looking at the main character, said that no one knows what will happen to the girl if he does not pay them now. But Adele Magnus, only calmly looking at the person in front of him, asked how much he wanted, and he named the amount of 10 gold coins, although he thought about it and said that he would be satisfied with 30 gold coins from each person. The protagonist only looked at them angrily and thought that she was madly sick of these people and their extortion, and she didn't know what to do now because she was vomiting blood right now. But at that moment, Adil Magnus took out all his money and handed it to the bandit and asked if it would be enough. Then he looked at them with a madly contemptuous look and ordered them to get out of here. They took the money fearfully and left immediately. And at that moment, Magnus approached the girl Adele and immediately picked her up to help her, and excitedly asked if she could wait until they got back to the manor. At this point, around the protagonist and Adele Magnus gathered excited residents who admired the young man and did not let them pass. He, only excited looking at this picture, asked them to disperse because his friend was ill and they had to go. But the residents asked him for help one by one, so the boy said that he had previously helped with housing for Martin's grandmother, and then said that his grandfather could use some. And the other guy, smiling, said he'd heard earlier that Adil Magnus had helped with a letter of recommendation to become a knight. And other residents looked at him and asked for help and told him they had their own problems. At this point, Anastasia Sinclair realized they weren't going to go away that easily. So after looking at the guy, she just kept quiet for a while, then told him he couldn't handle it unless he was bad, as she had previously taught him. For some time, he absolutely did not want to do it, but after a resolute look at the crowd that surrounded him, and the main character said that today they will not get any help from him. But the villagers just yelled at Adele Magnus and wondered why he was being so mean to them. He was supposed to do whatever they said. But after pointing fingers at the main character who was standing next to the young man, the residents accused the girl of whispering something in his ear, and apparently it was her fault that Adele Magnus refused to help them. The protagonist, however, had the unhappy thought that first they'd been accosted by drunks, And now this, and she didn't know what to do or if she could make it to her estate. But the next moment, seeing that the girls are getting worse and worse, the Deal Magnus threatened that they must give the road now or everything will be completely different. But they just laughed at him, and the little boy, with his hands in the air, asked, what could he do to them? It was unlikely that he would beat the weak and defenseless townspeople or use his powers on them. And the main character that watched the whole picture absolutely did not understand the behavior of the townspeople, and thought that maybe they just went crazy and did not understand why they cannot get behind them. And then excitedly looking around at the guys around her, the girl realized if he really dispersed the townspeople by force, it would end badly for him. So she realized that she had to think of something. So she stepped forward and asked for their attention for a moment, and taking off her hat, said that she was actually terminally ill and her disease was highly contagious, and she didn't even know what would happen to the townspeople if they touched her blood. Then the next moment, a whole stream of blood spurted from her mouth, and all the residents started screaming in excitement. Then immediately started scattering and accusing the girl of being crazy for doing something like that. But she only looked at the townspeople with displeasure, as if with some contempt, thinking that they were the ones who had gone mad, not Anastasia, who had decided to save her friend and herself. Then she put her hat back on and smiled, saying that it was much better now that there were no more people around, and turning to Adil Magnus suggested that he go home. But he only, unfortunately, looking at her, asked for forgiveness, after which he moved closer and hugged her tightly. With great regret in his voice, again asked for forgiveness. Finally, when they were in the carriage, Anastasia Sinclair put her head on Adil Magnus's shoulder and asked if the boy realized that what had happened was not his fault at all. But he didn't answer anything and just said that the girl needed to rest a bit, as she was insanely pale. Anastasia Sinclair only agreed with him and then smilingly informed him that he smelled insanely nice. But in the next moment, Adele Magnus became insanely sad again and apologized to Anastasia with great regret for not being able to protect her. She immediately got up from his shoulder excitedly and looked carefully into his face and convinced him that everything was really okay. But he said that it was all his fault, at which point the girl took a stern look. Adele asked Magnus how many times she would have to tell him it wasn't his fault. But at that moment, the guy only hesitated, realizing that his constant apologies must be making Anastasia uncomfortable. Looking at Adele Magnus like that, Anastasia Sinclair immediately realized that it was useless to convince him that it wasn't his fault, because he would continue to blame himself anyway, because that was the kind of person he was. As a result, the next morning after her nap, she was approached by a worried maid who was madly displeased with her bloody appearance last night. But Anastasia Sinclair smiled brightly and tried to explain that she was really fine and had had a wonderful night's sleep. The maid said that Anastasia Sinclair should stop lying to her because her face was still so pale. Then, still slicing the apple for her to eat, she said that she had frightened her out of her wits with her appearance yesterday, so she better stay in bed tonight. Anastasia Sinclair was madly disappointed by this and then noticed that her maid was talking just like Adele Magnus. But she only exhaled tiredly at her mistress' capriciousness and said that she should stop acting like this and listen to the people who cared for her. The girl heeded her advice, and as she lay down on the bed, she thought about the fact that she would have to spend the whole day in bed, and questions crept into her head about whether Adele Magnus would come to visit her today. But after the lullaby, she thought she was bored out of her mind, so she closed her eyes and just enjoyed the song, and eventually fell asleep. After a while, when the protagonist woke up, she was literally radiant, and everything really indicated that she was much better. So she happily told her maid that she had really been helped by sleep, and now she was ready for a new walk and asked if she could go for a little walk. But the maid, clearly tired after a sleepless night with her mistress and after hours of caring for her and monitoring her condition, only smiled and said that she had to change her clothes, and asked her to wait for a while. But fatigue did not go unnoticed by the protagonist, who looked at her excitedly, asked if she was all right, and asked if she was sure she wanted to go out with her. But Irina assured her that everything was all right, then smilingly said that she could not let Anastasia go out alone. They had already told the guards that they would go alone, but Anastasia, looking anxiously at the maid who looked so sickly, asked if she could go with her while she rested. But the girl only smiled insanely sweetly at the protagonist and told her that she was really fine and she could rest while they were outdoors. In the end, it was some more time, and having dressed the main character together with the maid, went outside, and then looking at the sky, the girl stated that the weather was today insanely cloudy, and most likely by the evening it would rain. Then the protagonist, addressing her by the name of Poe, asked if she would like to eat the parfait, and then told her that she would like to treat her, but she immediately guessed that apparently her mistress wanted to try such a dessert herself, and she just smiled awkwardly and admitted it. At this moment, the maid, raising her hands, smiled and informed Anastasia Sinclair that she was just a maid, so mistress like her didn't need to worry about her. But the girl only smiled and said that she didn't have much time left to live, so she wanted to be good in the memory of those she cared about. But it seems that such a statement madly angry maid, who, unhappily looking at the protagonist, angrily said that she still has a long time to live, and that she should not say anything like that in the future. But the next moment, Anastasia Sinclair was abruptly distracted when a big stone fell right near her foot. And when she looked back at the culprit, she saw a guy who awkwardly lost the back of his head and reported that he had done it completely by accident. But at that moment, the shocked protagonist immediately remembered this little guy, and it was one of those who had prevented them from passing yesterday and tried in every possible way to take advantage of Adil Magnus's kindness. So she stood angrily in front of her maid, as if to protect her from the boy, and then with a displeased look at him, she inquired why he was doing that and what he was doing. Then she angrily informed him that not all nobles were as kind as Adil Magnus. But he only with a maximum indifferent face asked the girl to forgive him on this, and the protagonist, looking at his face, immediately realized that apparently the boy just mocked her, after which Evil thought that such people absolutely do not deserve the kindness of her friend. But the next moment she turned sharply displeased and went away, and the excited maid inquired where the mistress was going, at which point Irina was called closer. Anastasia Sinclair said she had an urgent need to meet with Adil Magnus. In the end, the protagonist got into her carriage and went to the manor, where the guy lived, and on the way excitedly looking out the window thought that it turns out that her friend lived not even as far away as she thought, and then began to think about how she should introduce herself in order to be let through. But when the carriage pulled up, the excited guard was surprised enough to shout for the carriage to be let through, as it belonged to the Count. The main character seems to have been madly surprised by this turn of events, as she did not expect to be let through so easily, because the young man did not even check the passengers. Then Anastasia Sinclair thought that perhaps Adil Magnus's parents are close to her parents, so everything was fine. But when she got out of the carriage, she was already met by an excited Adil Magnus, who immediately ran up to her and looked at her questioningly, waiting for an explanation of her arrival. Then, when they didn't follow, he asked why she was traveling so far away. She was supposed to be resting, but Anastasia Sinclair calmly looked into the guy's face and said she just wanted to meet him, to which Adil Magnus awkwardly informed her that Anastasia Sinclair had better go back to her house because she might get worse. But she resolutely refused, and then the boy began to ask her, for he was not at all prepared for her arrival. But she only turned away like a resentful child and said she wasn't going anywhere. Then her eyes softened, and from under her hat, she looked at Adil Magnus and said she missed him, so she decided to come. After that, she asked if he was bored, but the guy answered absolutely nothing and seemed to look quite depressed to see such a reaction. Anastasia Sinclair offered to come inside for a while because she wanted something to drink, and the guy seemed quite grateful that she didn't ask him once. So smiling, he agreed and invited her inside. As a result, once inside, the protagonist excitedly noticed that even for her family, which is famous for its wealth, this estate looked amazing, and apparently this is how the power of the Sword of the Empire was expressed. Then looking at the servants, realized that the girls here looked very kind and was glad. And sipping water from the cup the maid had set out for her, thought that maybe she could tease Adil Magnus a little. So she asked if he could make tea. He smiled happily, then put the service and began to pour her a cup of tea. And the girl was madly excited and even awkwardly surprised that he made her tea personally and not asked the servant to do it. After he had done so, the girl asked him to add strawberry jam to her, and Adil Magnus, with absolutely no resistance, immediately followed her will. And then the satisfied girl sipped her tea and thanked him for it. But the next moment, setting her dessert plate down, the guy announced that he had brought her favorite chocolate ganache, as well as dark chocolate, milk chocolate, and almond candy, and asked her to take whatever she liked from the table. The main character was literally shocked and did not understand what happened with Adil Magnus, because earlier he said that he was absolutely not ready for her arrival, and did not understand where it all came from. But the next moment, the girl, smiling awkwardly, informed me that she didn't really like almonds very much, but thanked me for it anyway. But when Adil Magnus heard this, and even a little frightened her by his harshness, he rose from his seat and took away the desserts that contained almonds, looking at them with a kind of contempt as if they were his worst enemy. And at this moment, Anastasia Sinclair thought that she had a feeling that she would never see almonds in this house again, and that it was unlikely that they would ever come here again. But in order to make up for the awkwardness, she smiled. This awkwardness, she asked what Adil Magnus had been doing before she arrived. And the boy in turn calmly explained that he was just practicing. Then the girl inquired if she had distracted him from such a thing. But he also informed her in his usual manner that she could not distract him. But the next moment his face became insanely stern, and he looked at the protagonist and said that he didn't want to offend her, but she had made a crazy mistake when she came here. So he asked if she could go to her home. Seeing his face, a worried Anastasia Sinclair wondered what had happened and why Adil Magnus was acting so strangely and asked, had he stopped enjoying her company? But he only looked down at her worriedly and said that it wasn't like that at all and that he enjoyed spending time with her. But if something happened to Anastasia again and it was his fault, he wouldn't know how to react. And then the girl excitedly realized that apparently the guy was still worried about what had happened that time, and it seemed to have traumatized his psyche much more than she had expected. So she tried to put on as calm a face as possible and informed him that since she had tired Adil Magnus so much, she would sit for a while and then leave. Then she asked him to go on about his business. The guy agreed and then started reading a book, and the protagonist lay on the couch and thought that it seemed like nothing special was happening. But she was still insanely comfortable in the house of the young man. And after a while, she opened her eyes and then stood up abruptly when she realized that she had probably just fallen asleep. But wiping her mouth, she found no blood, and so she realized that everything was fine. Adil Magnus was still sitting across from her, and he looked at her and said that she was awake. Then he said that he wanted to take her to bed, but Anastasia Sinclair only laughed awkwardly and wondered why he hadn't woken her up. But the guy smiled calmly and said that the girl was fast asleep and he didn't want to disturb her sleep. Then he started to draw something on the paper. This did not go unnoticed by the protagonist, who quickly ran up to him and asked what he was doing. And her face contorted with admiration when she saw that Adil Magnus had been drawing her the whole time. And she told the guy admiringly that she hadn't even expected him to be able to draw like that. At this point, the guy looked down in embarrassment and said that we were sorry if she was offended because he didn't mean to offend her. He didn't mean to offend her because he didn't mean to offend her at all. He just thought she was pretty enough. But at that moment, the girl suddenly said that he should draw his nose a little higher. Eventually, Adele changed the portrait and showed it to the girl and asked her what she thought of him now. And she happily reported that now the portrait really did look perfect. After which she embarrassedly reported that she was now beautiful not only in life, but even on paper. But at this moment, Adil Magnus laughed, then embarrassedly reported that the girl was absolutely right, and she really was just beautiful. At which point Anastasia Sinclair embarrassedly snatched the drawing tablet from him and said it was her turn and she would like to try to draw it. Then she began to take approximate measurements and said that since Adil Magnus was so good at drawing her, she would also try to make an insanely beautiful portrait. After a little magic on the paper, she realized that she had absolutely nothing, but this drawing did not go unnoticed by Adil Magnus, who praised her talent and said that he was really crazy like himself. Then the protagonist, awkwardly and embarrassingly hiding the piece of paper, wondered if the guy had accidentally lost his mind, because it was completely unlike him. But he only smiled and asked if the protagonist could give him the drawing, because he liked it so much. The girl only blushed embarrassedly and realized that a guy like Adil Magnus would keep the drawing, and it would be the only reminder of her. Then she realized that she couldn't give him something like that. But finally, they were interrupted, and a servant came knocking into the room and informed Anastasia that the gentleman wished to speak to her. In the end, the maid caught them in a rather awkward position when Adil Magnus tried to take the drawing away from the main character, and she tried in every way possible to take it away in order not to embarrass herself. When the maid told her this, she was surprised, because she knew that Friedrich Magnus, Adil Magnus's father, was also a friend of the protagonist's father. So the two families had been connected for a long time. At least that was the description in the book. And then the girl thought about the fact that because of Anastasia Sinclair's illness, as well as the eternal quarrels with Adil Magnus, relations between the families were getting worse. But then she looked admiringly at the approaching man and literally glowed and didn't understand. She wondered if this could be a real person. He was handsome even for his age, and apparently Dill Magnus would be like that when she grew up. Eventually, the man came up to them and asked them to sit down, and then looked at Anastasia Sinclair and told them that they had not seen her for a long time and that she had lost a lot of weight, and apologized for not visiting her. But she calmly informed him that everything was fine. Then Friedrich Magnus smilingly inquired what had made the girl so happy, for she looked much brighter than before, even in spite of her illness. But at that moment, the protagonist looked at Adil Magnus and said that it was all his fault. When Friedrich Magnus heard about it, he only laughed and said that Anastasia Sinclair had always been offended when he asked about their relationship, and asked if his son was behaving well and if he had not upset her in any way. But she calmly said that everything was really fine, and Adil Magnus had been extremely courteous to her. At this moment, Friedrich Magnus, thinking, asked his son to step outside for a moment, as he wanted to speak to Lady Anastasia in private. He bowed his head overheard and left the room. And then smiling, Friedrich Magnus said that he didn't want to get involved in other people's business, but he was interested in what the girl really thought about his son. At that moment, she bent her head to think about the fact that the protagonist of the story, it was her friend, and he was the only person with whom she felt at ease and safe. Although sometimes Adil Magnus did act like a naive child, he was insanely generous, kind sweetheart, and even when sad. So the girl, smiling happily, informed that the son of Friedrich Magnus was an insanely important person to her. It seems that Friedrich Magnus was madly surprised by such a thing, after which he said that it was a rather surprising description. After all, many people perceive his son as a kind and fair guy, but no one had ever told him before that he was important enough. And then, looking closely at Anastasia Sinclair, asked if there was anything he could share with her. And then Friedrich Magnus remembered that when his son was little, he didn't knock, and just went into his room while he was sleeping. And then the child would wake up abruptly and act like he was being attacked and threatened to kill them all. Whereupon Friedrich Magnus bent to think about the fact that his son was clearly different from other people, but could not tell Anastasia Sinclair about it all. So looking around, the girl in front of him informed him that there was really nothing human about his son. He was a quick learner, but he had only become so kind and calm after they had instilled this behavior in him. Then he said with a kind of despair that their family had gone through a lot of trouble just so their son would grow up to be a good person, but he lost all confidence when his mom died. And since then, his thoughts have been insanely hard to understand, though he noticed that so far they were able to contain Adil Magnus' behavior. But the protagonist is only excited looking at Friedrich Magnus, wondering, is there anything their son can do? But he calmly informed her that it wasn't out of the question. Then he calmly looked her over and told her that he was just giving her a warning to be ready in case of an emergency. And the girl got excited and wondered for what reason Friedrich Magnus says such things about his son. Then she remembered that in the book, Friedrich Magnus was described as a rather careless man, and she had seen him just like that. But at that moment, distracting her from her thoughts, the man said that objectively speaking, his child is insanely smart and kind and intelligent, and he has the character that he inherited from his father and almost no weaknesses, and even without food, he will give his bread to his neighbor. But speaking of all this, Friedrich Magnus remarked that his son was only doing this because he had taught him to behave this way. Then he said that there was no such thing as a perfectly good person, and if Adil Magnus got wind of it, there would be trouble. That's what he was afraid of. Then the protagonist excitedly realized the reason why her friend was so kind all the time, and absolutely did not understand what she should do about it. But then, looking around excitedly, Anastasia Friedrich said that he had to go and suggested that they should have lunch together sometime. Then said that he wished the girl a speedy recovery. At this moment, Anastasia Sinclair rose abruptly from her seat and looked round with great confidence at Friedrich Magnus, inquired, was he only concerned about her because of his son? But he calmly looked at Anastasia with some displeasure and explained that she was the daughter of his friend, and he regarded her as his own daughter. Then he asked if she remembered any occasions when he had asked her not to come to their estate again, and said it was insanely unpleasant to say, but he had to do it, even though her father could begin with a shoe. When the protagonist heard about it, she bowed her head in embarrassment and apologized. But he said that everything was fine, and he was happy that she and his son had reconciled anyway. So he said that he would try to visit her more often. The protagonist was only excited to see him and told him that he didn't have to waste his time on it at all. But he told her that he was her godfather after all. And he had a matching tea set, and added that this tea set was expensive even for their family. But he had absolutely nothing to spare for the girl. Thinking about it, Anastasia Sinclair realized that he must be referring to the lost national treasure of the empire. But the next moment, Friedrich Magnus smiled and said that he would prepare more gifts for Anastasia Sinclair since he had a knack for it, so she could take it easy. But Anastasia Sinclair only excitedly informed him that he shouldn't overdo it. At that moment, Adil entered the room and smiled happily at the protagonist and asked if everything had gone well, as she had been talking to his father for quite some time. But She-Girl calmly smiled and informed that everything was fine since the Duke was insanely kind to her. It seems that Dual Magnus really calmed down when she heard about it and said that she was worried because a lot of people didn't like his father very much. Then he remembered that he had once seen a marquis spitting on their fence as he walked by, and he and his father had had a disagreement about the diamond mine. Then he added that Ash Cloud was the son of that marquis. But afterward, he remembered that the festival would be open in a month and informed the girl about it. The main character was madly surprised that the festival would be open and inquired. Did Adele say that because she wanted to invite her? But he just looked at her worriedly and wondered. If the girl wanted to go, she just smiled and said it was okay if he was going to go with someone else. But he looked at her with determination and admitted that he only wanted to go there with her. Then he said that after the last time he realized how important the girl was to him, and she was no match for the others. Then she promised that nothing bad would happen in the future. But if he did, he would definitely be on her side. Looking at the young man's face so determined, Anastasia Sinclair only apologized for making him worry. But he calmly said it was more his fault than hers and promised to make it up to her. Then she looked surprised at Adele Magnus's face and wondered if he was going to be the bad guy and ignore everyone. Then excitedly looking at the main character Adele, wondered if his girlfriend would hate him if he became a villain. But she just smiled calmly and looked at him with great tenderness and told him that she would never do such a thing in her life. And the guy still looked at her uncertainly and asked her to promise. And then she said, laying her hand on her heart, that she promised that she would never turn her back on the young man, even if he became insanely angry. When he heard this, the guy seemed to be very relieved and said that now he would be able to litter in the street. When Anastasia heard this, she laughed and wondered if he was planning to throw wrappers everywhere. But Adele said he was going to do something worse. When she heard this, Anastasia rose abruptly from her seat and wondered if the boy was not going to throw away her scary drawing. Bottom line, after a while, the protagonist went out to dinner with Friedrich and Adol. And then the guy awkwardly said that he couldn't remember the last time they all got together for dinner. But then Friedrich, looking carefully at Anastasia, said that only the best vegetables were served for her because she needed healthy food. While looking at it, the girl began to add various spices to brighten up the flavor of the dish. And noticing this, Friedrich asked if she was adding too much spices, but the girl only laughed and said that she did it all the time. At this, Friedrich only smiled and said that Anastasia looked uncannily like her father. At which point, Anastasia took the opportunity to ask if her father wrote letters to Friedrich. Then he said that he receives letters quite often and also sends them when he manages to find out something about the medicine for Anastasia. So as soon as he learns new information, he immediately sends it to the father of the main character, who immediately tries to check everything. Then sadly reported that he had recently gotten some useful potions, but it was insanely hard to create them. The protagonist, only madly guilty, looking at the man, reported that apparently gave them a lot of trouble, but he only calmly reported that he is ready for anything for the sake of his daughter. Then he warned the protagonist that she should not tell her father that he called her that because it was a secret that no one but the two of them could know about. The girl happily agreed and then thought that she was sometimes afraid of her father's anger even herself.